Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in about 1 minute, just letting people filter in right now. Thank you so much. All right, for the sake of time, it's 11:02. I'd like to cordially invite everyone to give a big round of applause to Jean for putting this together. Without her, none of this would be possible. So thank you so much for all of your help, Jean. It's been really instrumental in making this conference work. My name is David. I'm helping organize this conference, have been doing so for 10 months. I'm extremely grateful to all of our panelists. And without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to today's moderator, Sharon, also assisted by two chairs, Daniel and Allison. Thank you all so much.
I'm actually going to jump in first here, David, but let me start by saying how much I and certainly this panel appreciates all the work that you, Jean, and the rest of the Environmental Peacebuilding team has done to put this together and to change on the fly and to make this work seamlessly. It is, I'm sure, appreciated by everybody. So acknowledge and appreciate it. And just as we get started, just a reminder about the, by being here, be a good colleague and a good human. Any disruptions will not be tolerated, and there will be consequences. Second, just a reminder that this is going to be recorded, and also that we are fortunate enough to have interpreters. So many, many thanks to them and their hard work, and really appreciate the fact that that service is available and they'll be here. And thank you all for coming. So I'm Daniel Abrahams. I am a AAAS fellow at USAID, where I serve as the Climate and Conflict Advisor, and along with Allison Brown, helped organize this session. So thank you again for coming. I'm going to keep my comments very brief because we have an incredibly distinguished panel and I want to give them as much time as possible. But as I see it, as many of the plenaries have described, this community of practice of which we are all a part is at an important juncture. We are coming to terms with the profound ways that the impacts of climate change, of biodiversity loss, of unsustainable resource extraction, how those will all alter the security landscape. We also are no longer focused on these questions solely as a matter of causality, but really starting to conceptualize how we respond to these issues. So as we transition from identifying these mechanisms to how we operationalize our response, we have to confront a seemingly obvious but very easy to overlook question, which is, what are we missing? What is being overlooked? What is being misunderstood? What is perhaps being inappropriately deprioritized? Because doing so carries consequences. Because if we fail to give sufficient attention to the severity, the severity of these challenges will not recede. They will spread, they will intensify, and they will cascade into unforeseen human security challenges. So our goal in organizing this panel is to shine a light on some of these issues which we might be missing. But the broader goal is to highlight the diverse ways in which we can productively approach environmental security questions. And we have a really exciting panel to do that with. We are covering everything from the centrality of religion in environmental peacebuilding to ways in which conflict dynamics can affect the flows of climate finance. The breadth of this, I think, is reflective of the field's trajectory. And I'm confident that the innovative thinking that Jerome, Corey, Catherine, Elliot, Olivia, and Tracy are doing is key for addressing the new and burgeoning issues of environmental peacebuilding. And I'll let the panelists introduce themselves. I'm not going to give their bios. So from the perspective of USAID, where I'm currently working, and thinking about how we respond to these joint challenges in the mid and long term, the ideas that they will all present, I believe, are critical for charting a path forward. And with that, I'm going to turn to our expert moderator and frankly, a real trailblazer in this space, Sharon Burke, who's the president of Ecospherics and formerly a U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense, who by the way, holds the rights to swear at any panelists who go over their allotted time, and really appreciate her engagement on this. And Sharon, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for you and Allison putting together this wonderful event and this terrific panel. And I swear by them, but never at them. So, but we will try to keep time. So everybody's on fair warning here. So let me just quickly review what we're going to do here on this panel. We're going to start with 30 minutes of lightning quick presentations, panelists. Each one is going to give you 3 to 5 minutes of their take on this. I'll briefly introduce them, but I really encourage you to look at the full bios online. I don't want to take up time because these are people with impressive resumes and you should know more about them. So take the time to look them up if you would, please. Then we'll have about 30 minutes of crosstalk, of discussion, and you should feel free as participants to add comments into the chat at any time. And in the last 30 minutes, we'll open it up to a full discussion. We're going to hear at the very end, though, from Allison Brown of USAID with some closing comments. So I'm looking forward to that as well. So just to start with a quick personal note, I was really excited to be part of this discussion when Daniel approached me, because as a former US official, I am painfully aware that my government, that many governments are set up to manage one issue area at a time, and that many universities are similarly divided by disciplines. But climate change, biodiversity loss, critical minerals, water, gender, faith, income inequality, history, enmity, these drivers and factors, they just don't stay inside of neat lines. How do we govern in that kind of complexity? And what are we as a broader community of practice missing, as Daniel said? And we mean this not as fodder for some kind of sterile contrarian debate, which I think we see sometimes in academia, pardon me for the gratuitous practitioner statement, but rather this is part of charting a path to better understanding and governance. And I should start by acknowledging that we did not intend for people with disabilities to be one of our knowledge gaps. So please consider this session retitled, and we'll all come up with a better vernacular for this gap spanning exercise that we want to get into. So with that, let's get started. Allow me to introduce our first speaker, and I'm going to make sure I get the order right here. Corey Patterson. So Corey is a program manager in the Environmental Security Unit at the United Nations Environment Program, but he has a long history of working in this space, especially at the World Bank. And I believe he's joining us from Africa. So he is very actively involved in the field and also is a deep thinker on this subject. Corey, why don't you give us your thoughts here on these gaps and what we're missing?
All right, thanks a lot, Sharon, and everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. And apologies if any audio issues. Greetings from Nairobi. What I'd like to suggest is that amongst our growing community of practice, we tend to focus on the notion of scarcity, particularly around natural resources, as a link between environmental change and conflict. But I fear what we overlook is the evidence that tells us that it's also relative abundance that can instigate conflict under certain conditions, of course. So as you mentioned, Sharon and I work mostly in West Africa, and particularly the Sahel, which is shown on the maps here. It's a major region of concern for environmental security because it's simultaneously afflicted by metastasizing jihadist insurgency, a sharp rise in conflict between farmers and pastoral herders, and it's also warming at one of the fastest rates in the world. The map on the upper right shows that some parts have already increased an increase in average maximum monthly temperature between 1 and 1.5 degrees Celsius from just the beginning of this century. And these are all unfolding in a context where most of the population is rural and poor and thus vulnerable to small changes in crop production. And because of the confluence of these factors, and particularly because farmer-herder conflict is driving a large part of the increase in conflict events, much of the research and programming, at least that I see, is based on an assumption that scarcity of resources is the primary driver of this conflict, whether it's by causing pastoralists to expand to new grazing areas, intercommunal conflict over water rights, or that diminished livelihoods make it easier for armed groups to recruit. But our preoccupation with these themes, I feel, tends to blind us to the fact that there are many areas that experience acute resource competition without violence. If we take a look again at the map, we see that there's no clear spatial correlation between those areas which are heating fastest, again, on the upper right, and areas of conflict on the left. And actually, if we compare conflict events to the map on the bottom right, which shows changes in biomass, which is a proxy for crop health, we see a more obvious positive spatial correlation with increased biomass, actually. To take another example, while it might be true that pastoral herders are changing the patterns of their livestock movements, which can create friction with other resource users, this isn't necessarily a response to scarcity, but it can be an opportunistic movement to take advantage of attractive grazing areas or expanding urban markets. Of course, resource pressures are important, but they're unfolding against a backdrop of social and economic and political changes. And I think we really need to put those back at the center of this narrative about the rising conflict in the region and likely elsewhere. And these patterns include corruption and impunity, which manifests in a lack of legitimacy of local institutions to resolve disputes around resources when they do occur. Politicization, rural development policies are seen to privilege or disadvantage one group over the other, particularly in the West African context, policies that are seen to favor the expansion of agricultural production over pastoral systems. And privatization, as land is irrigated, it becomes more valuable, which leads to competition over property rights and a decrease in communal land. So it's a kind of market-induced scarcity, but it's created by relative abundance, not by climate change. So what does this tell us about what we should be doing differently, and how does it help us to do that better? So first, by rebalancing between scarcity and abundance, I think we can better anticipate where we expect to see conflict related to environmental change. We should be focusing on areas with large relative deviation from a prior environmental equilibrium, not just areas of drought, for example. Whether Africa or elsewhere, higher priority, I think, should be given to such areas where A, governance is already poor or starting to erode, or B, where governance arrangements are effectively non-existent because the land or water was not formerly a usable resource. This includes resources that are opened up by a changing climate. The Arctic is a good example, as well as those which are opened up by development interventions, which brings me to my second and final point. And that is that by stepping back from a focus exclusively on scarcity, I think it also offers us insights into how to better design interventions, because it reminds us that governance is really at the core of this link between environment and security. So for example, we know that investing in resilience and adaptation in the areas most vulnerable to climate impacts is critical, and it needs to be scaled up. But to make sure that those efforts to do so do not themselves cause conflict, we also need to scale up associated investments in multi-actor consultations to arrive at social agreements on the use of common resources amongst all local parties. And there are good examples of this, and I can share them in the chat. And finally, while these investments are important, they may not be solving the problems we think they are. Here, focusing only on scarcity can limit us in ways that recalls to me the way the development community focused on jobs as a panacea to preventing violent conflict in the early 2000s. Whereas billions of dollars and many assessments later, we were reminded that what people tend to fight over is notions of injustice and inequality and dignity. And so if we're focused on preventing violent conflict, even when it's impacted by climate change, we need to keep those things at the center of our minds. I'll stop there. Thanks a lot.
That was great, Corey. And I'm sure that everyone's going to have a lot of questions for you, but that core message that the simplistic narrative, that scarcity, that climate affects scarcity, scarcity causes conflict, that if I understand you right, and let me make sure that I have it, that one of the big dangers there is that you misapply solutions, and that investments not only won't solve the problems, but could be creating new problems. Is that a fair encapsulation?
I think that's right. Yeah, thanks.
And have you seen that in your practice? A lot of sort of misapplied answers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think our analytic tools tend to not concentrate on these areas where we're seeing conflict, right? They tend to focus on areas of vulnerability, which is an important thing in its own right. But they may be, again, blind spots, missing things about trying to understand where these trajectories are heading. And we have plenty of examples, which again, I'm happy to share in more detail about development interventions, water holes, for example, that are put in contested areas without the kind of associated social arrangements that I was alluding to, which have provoked conflict and actually led to violence.
That's fascinating. And I do think when we get into a discussion, I think it'd be great if you could be prepared to talk about, what good looks like. And especially you have the maps up. What are some of the tools that help us get to good? So thank you, Corey. With that, I'd like to move on to our next speaker. And by the way, I just want to point out that Corey did a very admirable job of covering complicated terrain clearly and quickly. So over to you, Catherine. There's the challenge for you. Which I know you're equal to, because Catherine Wong is a policy specialist on climate and security risk and the global technical lead on climate and security within UNDP's Global Policy Network. I've gotten to know her as she's been part of the UN's climate security mechanism, and she's a wonderful thought leader in this space and a practitioner as well. And with that, I would like to invite Catherine to give her remarks.
Thanks so much, Sharon, and very many thanks again to NPACS, to USAID, in particular to Daniel and to Alison for convening us today. It's an honor to be part of such an esteemed panel. I think in terms of blind spots, I would say, first of all, environmental security and environmental peace building, thinking back for the years, have really done so much to close the gap in terms of our understanding of environmental degradation and the loss of natural capital in relation to peace and security. Arguably, they have overlooked climate change due to the timeframes, the differences in timeframes, conflict versus climate, and then also the impacts of climate change, given that they are so diffuse. But in more recent years, the climate security agenda has endeavored to address this gap, specifically looking at so-called climate-related security risks. And I think one of the problems here is actually the problem definition itself. Most of the time we are looking in one direction. We are looking at climate change and environmental degradation in relation to peace, stability, and security. And I would say that one of the blind spots for us really is this so-called reverse linkage. Conflict and fragility also impact on climate action and access to climate finance. But when we look at the international negotiations on climate change, just as when we look at climate finance, there's a focus on two overarching frames of reference. The first one is income, the second is emissions levels. And with high income levels, we have high emission levels, with low income levels, low emission levels. And through this construct, we have an understanding and additional support in place for least developed countries and for SIDS. But with this construct, conflict and fragility are missing. There's really no nuanced understanding of peace, of security, of fragility. And we know that it's not a straight cut as that. 70% of fragile states are LDCs. And on the other hand,
Catherine, pardon me for interrupting, but I just wanted to let you know that our interpreters are having trouble keeping up with you. So I realize that's because you have a lot of very important things to say, but if you could slow down just a little bit, they want to make sure they're getting everything you say translated into French and Spanish and so on. So if you don't mind, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No problem at all. I'll try to slow down, trying to make the very best use of my 3 to 5 minutes. Apologies to the interpreters, but yes. So if we're looking, if we're looking at conflict and fragility, they cut across all income levels. 70% of fragile states are LDCs. Around 50% of LDCs are also included on the World Bank's harmonized list of fragile states. And taking the OECD's data on global public climate finance, for example, we see that some of the lowest recipients of climate finance not only include low-income countries, but also high-income countries affected by conflict in Arab states region, and also middle-income countries that are conflict affected in other regions. So there's really an imperative here to address the bottlenecks, the gaps in access to climate finance by conflict affected and fragile contexts, many of which are also highly vulnerable to climate change. And when we first started working in this space, many people dismiss this. They already said we're working already on the kind of intersection between climate change, environment, peace and security in our programming initiatives. But I think we understand that finance is different from programming. It's a question of supply and demand. And if we're starting with programming, we're starting at the micro level. One would have to input into every single project to be able to have substantive changes in the way that we program. But if we start with climate finance, we change the incentives. We go to the source, and we have the possibility to realize a systemic change in terms of what we are doing. The caveat here is obviously that good programming and good design informs finance, and vice versa. And finance, on the subject of finance, as Sharon mentioned in her remarks as well, it's really difficult to get finance for nexus topics. If you think about climate security, like environmental peacebuilding, it is climate, it is security, but it's not climate, it's not security. And donors simply don't have an earmarking or a budget line which they can use to support this work. This brings me to my last 2 points. And again, on the allocation of climate finance, metrics is key here. And for me, the co-benefits and the co-costs argument is missing. And what I mean by that is the positive or negative effects that a policy aimed at one objective might have on other objectives. And of course, we will understand that the co-benefits of climate action go beyond what is simply what we can call the environmental benefits. But in policymaking, consideration of non-market and non-environmental co-benefits are often overlooked, and if not underestimated, in relation to adaptation vis-a-vis mitigation, and even more so for peace, stability, and security, which remain far less analysed and less well codified. I think in our work together with the climate security mechanism, we found that if we are able to be a first step to more effective allocation. And just the very final point, there's very little literature that looks on climate finance and peace. That literature which looks at adaptation, but mitigation finance is also being implemented in conflict-affected and fragile contexts. An imperative here to look at both in relation to conflict risks, but also co-benefits and the so-called peace dividend.
Thank you, Catherine. That's great. When you talk about climate finance, are you talking about all country pledges, all country contributions, or any source of funding across the UN network? I'm just curious where that 14.4 billion is coming from.
Thanks so much, Sharon. This focuses on climate change financing that's available through the vertical funds. I think this is really important because this is concessional finance, which is critical and urgently needed by conflict-affected and fragile contexts.
I'm sorry, it says there right on your slide. So, and then when you say that part of the approach here has to be mainstreaming climate security risks into climate finance, are you seeing an appetite for that in the UN member countries? Are you getting a good response on that approach?
Thanks, Sharon. That's a great question. I think the work of the GEF, for example, the Global Environmental Facility, has been quite instrumental here. In addition, the work of the Peace Building Fund as well.
That's great. I think pointing out that money is a missing piece, but also how we think about money is a really important point that I know we'll come back to in the conversation. So with that, I'd like to move to our next speaker and point out that, again, Catherine was very admirable at covering a lot of territory very cogently. So it's over to you, Elliot Levine. So Elliot is a climate change and environment expert with a couple of decades of experience, and he's currently the director of Mercy Corps' Environment Technical Support Unit. And that's how I got to know Elliot, and really admire his work at the cutting edge of how we put climate security and other environmental challenges into practice in the field. So Elliot, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. And good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all. And just want to say, like others have acknowledged, it's really exciting to be part of this panel. Many of those represented here are those I've had the pleasure of learning a lot from over the last couple of years and engaging with. So very excited to be part of this. I'll just say, Sharon mentioned I work for Mercy Corps. So Mercy Corps has been, working in places like Colombia, Nigeria, Somalia, to Afghanistan and Myanmar, working to really build resilience to climate change and conflict for years and decades now. And over the last few years, I think it's fair to say that we've steadily increased our focus on the nexus of climate change and conflict, really exploring through research and the implementation of our programs what it means, what it means for our work to address both of those at the same time, as well as their interactions. And we've just published a report that synthesizes all that work and our experiences, and I'll drop the link to that for those who are interested. But today I'm just going to highlight some practical challenges that we observed in regards to sort of program design and implementation, as well as what I think might be driving it. And I just want to caveat this by saying, and to be really transparent, by identifying these challenges, I'm not saying that they're not challenges for Mercy Corps too. We have many struggles in implementing these types of programs, and these are the things that we are actively dealing with ourselves. But the big gap or blind spot that we're seeing at this moment is that while there's increasingly strong consensus that climate change and conflict intersect, and that each of these compound each other in various ways, there is much less knowledge right now about actually how to address those associated risks on the ground through programs. And this gap or blind spot or challenge was really made aware to us a little while back with in regards to support we were some research we were doing. Mercy Corps set out to understand sort of the landscape of existing approaches employed by the international development community through a report that was commissioned by the UK government. And while I would never claim this to be an exhaustive assessment, we do feel we were able to at least get to a fair and representative description of the, I guess, what you would call the state of play, if you will. And so I wanted to draw out just 3 drivers or dynamics that I think are leading to this challenge around, our gap in understanding of how to address this nexus. And the first is that what we found is that there is a fairly shallow and slightly narrow well of program and experience that we can actually draw upon. In part, this is due to finance challenges, which Catherine just spoke really, really well of. So I'll put that aside for a moment. But it was surprisingly challenging to actually identify programs which representatives would say they were explicitly addressing the intersection of climate change and conflict. And of the programs we did survey, approaches overwhelmingly focused on community-based natural resource management approaches, often employing a fairly similar set of approaches involving most often sort of involving resource sharing agreements. And team members implementing those programs really acknowledged that it was challenging to integrate climate considerations and climate risks into that work. We found this pretty interesting, given that the acknowledgement of the multiple pathways by which climate change can lead to conflict. There's more there, but I'll leave that for now. The second dynamic that I'll just bring our attention to is the lag in climate security assessment tools and approaches that we've seen. Similarly, we conducted a bit of a review following up on that initial work of climate conflict assessment methodologies. The review encompassed more than 20 tools. We scored each of those according to a set of variables, which I'd be happy to talk about in the conversation. And our research found that there are an abundance of high-level global, regional, and national efforts that aim to better understand climate security hotspots or broad threats. And these are really a super helpful starting point for broad program design, such as like geographic focus and where we should be putting investments. But they do struggle to provide the level of detail required by implementing agencies like Mercy Corps and our peers tasked with designing program activities in collaboration with communities, and often being sort of guided by donor priorities as well. Actors like Mercy Corps need a much more sort of localized understanding of, and sort of complexity of the drivers that are contributing to climate change, so that we don't avoid implementing programs that are hitting the wrong targets. Furthermore, while many of the research efforts aimed at unpacking climate and conflict risks do a good job of providing some actionable information, and there are plenty of really great examples out there, the methodologies they employ really just don't fit easily into contemporary program development timeframes. The time investment, financial resources, and at times reliance on really deeply technical and scientific studies are all barriers that I would cite there. To begin chipping away at this challenge, Mercy Corps is partnering with Daniel, Allison, and others at USAID to implement an assessment methodology based on the framework that I believe is on the slide to your right-hand side. And we're excited to be doing that. And the third and final thing I'll just point to dynamic is the sort of lack of evaluative research. We found in a lot of the program reviews that we've done, and we've struggled with this in our own work as well, is that many programs refer to positive gains in their programs, often through case studies, really useful and deeply qualitative reviews of the work they've done. But actual impact evaluations of programs demonstrating improvements to peace or adaptation outcomes are much rarer. And as a consequence, donors and implementers really just, we know too little about how to tailor our programs to different contexts. So those are just a couple of challenges I'll lay out. And I just want to finish off by saying that despite these, though, we've seen a lot of advancement in this space, and we're still really passionately convinced that these programs can have great impact. We just need to get over a couple of challenges on the implementation and design side for sure. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you, Elliot. And this is great. I think it's really fascinating to have an operating organization like Mercy Corps that's studying and trying to understand the complexities. But I'm wondering if you could just, and you kind of alluded to this, like that the chart you have up on the screen with the sort of maps the complexity. How do the people in the field, who I think are very much in the moment because they have to be, how do you cross that particular gap? How do you put a complex model like that for this is what you need to think about into the hands of somebody who's like right now?
Yeah, there's a cultural element there. There is there are a lot of elements and challenges you have to get over to deal with that. And I would say this is one of the reasons we've honed in on assessment methodologies. Within Mercy Corps and our peers, assessments are the primary way in which not only that we design a program, but that we unite a team around a program vision, the drivers behind that program vision. And so, while this framework may look pretty complicated at the moment, we know that utilizing these types of tools, putting them into practice through practical, time-bound assessment methodologies can get us to a point where we can bring individuals together to implement a program and a vision and really understand the driving forces behind it, which is critical. So yeah.
And I imagine part of the burden on you and your unit is to try to make it easy to implement, even if it's got a complicated backstory.
Yes, I mean, that's 100%. I mean, that's one of the driving forces here. I mean, as I mentioned, there's a lot of there's an abundance of fantastic research with really robust methodologies out there with great publications. As an agency that would be responsible for implementing something and maybe, so let's say, starting off a program, a 3-year program or a 5-year program with a 1-month inception phase to do all the studies and everything we have to do, we'd be really challenged to undertake some of those research efforts that were done by different technical institutions, think tanks, academic institutions within the time frame. We've experimented with other ways of doing that, but ultimately so much gets done in the beginning of that program, startup.
Great. Thank you, Elliot. And I just want to point you towards the chat because you've one person asking for the report on the tools and methodologies and another pointing out that there's a missing dimension in your flowchart about the way that the sort of loop that environmental degradation caused by conflict is part of the problem. So if I just want to point out that that there are people addressing you directly in the chat. And we will come back to questions, but first I want to get to the next speaker, who is Jerome Tara. He is an assistant professor of religion, conflict, and peacebuilding, and a former director of the Center for Religion, Conflict, and Globalization at the University of Groningen. So his areas of expertise are religion, conflict, peacebuilding, reconciliation, and climate change, and inherently how all these things fit together. And I'm really excited to hear what Jerome has to say. So take it over if you would, please.
Thank you very much, Sharon. It's a pleasure to be here. I will start from the question that you all see on the screen. And it reads, what happens when climate-induced conflicts involve sacred beliefs and practices? This is not a question one would expect to hear in climate security discussions, especially considering how much effort is being put in improving technology and smart infrastructures, increasing climate financing, and conducting excellent research, among many other initiatives to address climate change challenges. But the thing is, most of the communities that experience climate-related insecurity are not only signs of climate change vulnerability and conflict, but also of high religiosity and spirituality. Thus, we are confronted. Do I hear something in the background? Is it me or?
I'm not sure if that's you. If it's someone else, could you please mute? If you are not the speaker, could you please mute? We're picking up somebody's news feed, which I'm sure is very important, but I really want to hear what Jerome has to say.
Thank you. I will proceed. I was just saying that most of the communities that experience climate-related insecurity are not only sites of climate change and climate change vulnerability and conflict, but also high religiosity and spirituality. So we are confronted with climate-induced conflicts in contexts where communities survive on environmental resources, which they relate with on sacred terms or consider sacred. Hence, they are prepared to take extraordinary measures, such as engaging in bloody conflicts to protect what they consider sacred, such as land, water, or cattle. To be concrete, and by way of example, in a research that I conducted in Kenya among the Pokot community, it emerged that elders and religious leaders bless the cattle raiders. And one respondent actually said in an interview, and I shared this, I think, with Corey and Daniel at some point, he said, "It is better to die in the footsteps of a cow than to die a mere death." This means that this community has a different form of valuing its natural resources, in this case, cattle. Therefore, cultural considerations and cultural circumstances and social situatedness of the value of resources shape the actions and reactions of some communities during climate-induced conflicts. Yet they are muted or sidestepped in program design and debates on climate security. But don't get me wrong, the full power of techno-scientific approaches is crucial for the most up-to-date understanding of climate system. However, if it is stripped of the human and cultural dimensions, it might be misunderstood and misused and permeated by political and epistemological normativity. So I think it is helpful to facilitate a constructive dialogue between socioeconomic, political, scientific, and technological approaches and human and cultural dimensions of climate security risks. Because as we all know, climate change challenges are ontologically complex. To conclude, I think sacred beliefs and practices are overlooked, as we're calling here blind spots, in climate security scholarship, policy, and practice, that if explored can capture the localized perceptions of nature and security. It might maybe answer the question why, despite the availability of huge funding, excellent science, improved smart infrastructures, why these conflicts persist frequently, intensely, and intractably. And maybe answering this question will inform new ways of developing intervention strategies. I will stop here.
Thank you. That was fascinating. And as a former policy practitioner, the question that comes right to the top of my mind is what's the best way to do this? Like, I'm utterly persuaded by your thesis that sacred beliefs and practices are very important nuance and factors and drivers to incorporate. How do we do it? what's the best way to incorporate these considerations? Do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, which I get asked often. Like, how do you operationalize this? I mean, it's not surprising, also considering that modern technology, and rightly so, is really doing a lot of work to improve or address climate change challenges. But I think one way to sort of operationalize this whole idea of sacred beliefs and practices, religion and spirituality, is to engage with the relevant stakeholders, engage with the local communities. What is it that makes, how do they make sense of their own life and experiences? I mean, we have heard, I think, Corey earlier saying, resource scarcity can lead to conflict, but it doesn't have to. In other contexts, there's an argument that it might also lead to cooperation. And resource abundance also is no necessary connection to conflict or peace. So something must be happening. There must be something therefore in the mix. And maybe we need to look elsewhere and to see what is in that, even if we have resource scarcity or resource abundance, we still find conflict in place. And it might also be the fact that how people value the natural resources, and more so in a sacral way, might be influencing how they position themselves, when they find themselves in this kind of conflict. So I think more involvement of local communities, more involvement of cultural traditional leaders, and moving from where they are towards what we have to share, rather than moving from what we have to share towards where they are. This might not provide sustainable interventions.
Thank you. And I know I listened to the UN's presentation yesterday on Strata, this new analytical decision support tool. And it seems like that's an interesting challenge that you're laying out too, for how do we integrate these kinds of variables into those tools that help us understand. And it sounds like one of the things you're saying is in a way you can't, you have to have local content and local knowledge in your programming. Is that fair to say?
It is fair to say, and I mean, it's also a knowledge production question. How do we produce knowledge about climate security? And what is, and even interestingly, even to implement a particular model or technical approach, there are also particular beliefs behind. So there are even particular beliefs about which knowledge is important. So I think it is indeed important to give space to this kind of knowledges. It might be difficult to do so because we are used to quantifying things and getting things in boxes and so forth. But this is it doesn't fit, and it's often we go like, well, this takes long to kind of process. Let's work with that which gives us the opportunity to move faster. But I think we need to be to allow ourselves to take the challenge.
I am with you, and Jerome, I want to also encourage you as well as the other panelists, go ahead and feel free to engage with people in the chat. I think Matthew Stott in particular posed a really interesting comment and question about that nations think in terms of hard power and resource accordingly. So I just want to encourage you to engage. And then we'll go to our next speaker, Olivia Lazar. So Olivia is currently a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe, and her research focuses on the geopolitics of climate, the transition ushered by climate change, and the risks of conflict and fragility associated with climate change and environmental collapse. Olivia also has a long history of doing work directly in the field with her own consulting firm, Peace and Design Consulting. And I know that I've read her work with great interest, so I'm delighted to hear what she has to say. Olivia?
Thank you, Sharon. And thank you, Daniel, for inviting me to be part of the panel. It's quite a pleasure because it really does feel like being amongst friends. And I'm also quite glad to be the fourth or fifth speaker, because what I picked up from the previous interventions is something that is very much on my mind, which is essentially the mismatch between the might of the challenge that we have to face in terms of, changes in biophysics due to climate change, environmental collapse, and the resources, the analytical scopes or frames that we're using available, and also the type of programming and process design that we're currently using. What we've identified as part of our research at Carnegie Europe is that essentially climate change calls for a rethink and a reconceptualization of global security. And what I've been hearing from previous interventions is indeed, like looking at regional levels, for example, such as what Corey was inviting us to do to a certain extent, looking at granular level, such as what Elliot was also inviting us to do, what it means in terms of operationalization, what it means in terms of stakeholder management, et cetera, et cetera. But I kind of want to sort of, look at the sort of global level first to highlight essentially something that a lot of people, particularly in the policy and peacemaking world, have missed in the climate security conversation, which is essentially that conflict and fragile zones are not just bearing the brunt of climate disruptions. They are not marginal to climate action. They're actually really central. Because if you look at the map on the left-hand side of the slide, it's a map that was published in the Nature Journal about, a year and a half ago. You can find the references in our Carnegie Europe report, which I posted in the chat. This map highlights the global regeneration priority areas. These are all the ecosystems, particularly terrestrial ecosystems, that need to be legally protected, that need to be regenerated, and that need to be sustained on the basis of regenerative work. If you look at the orange and red spots, they are all located within the tropics, just above and just under. And as it so happens, they are also very much located in fragile and conflict-affected zones. And it's no surprise because, as Corey was mentioning, there is an issue regarding abundance and essentially how natural resources, let it be timber, animal and vegetable biodiversity, water, soil, and in some circumstances, mineral and fossils are actively part of conflict economies, and they are part of a nexus linking essentially predatory behavior on the part of elites and various communities with extraction writ large. And the more, we only understand sort of climate change or only equate it as being the result of the release of excess greenhouse gases into the atmosphere because of industrial emissions, the more we're going to miss essentially that there is an equally large problem which is located in conflict and fragile zones, which is the plundering of biodiversity and the plundering of the terrestrial and marine ecosystems that actually regulate the global climate regime. And that means that, we have to sort of send a message to policymaking circles and to peacemaking communities, which is that actors working to reduce conflict, to transform conflict, to solve conflicts are actually frontliners in the fight against climate change. They are primary actors. They need more resources. They need more support. They need more, they need essentially an enabling environment in order to scale up their work conceptually, process-wise, programmatically wise, and obviously, as Catherine was saying, in terms of finances as well. So there is a backbone here. And from more of a granular perspective, it also means that the people working in conflict-affected and fragile zones also need to adopt new ways of working, adopt new types of competencies. And many in the room have, heard me talk before about how we need to move towards ecological design, working on the basis of ecosystems-based mapping, in order to actually sort of understand how to harness working with communities, working with political mediation actors in order to see how we can shift stabilization efforts and peacemaking efforts towards cooperating on the basis of regenerative processes. And that is going to have local benefits in the form of ecological services serving food security, water security, buffering against extremes, but it's also going to have those global benefits in terms of fighting against climate change. And that means that we also need to focus very intently on a sort of, a nut that has been historically very tough to crack, which is how do we address conflict economies? How do we address predatory and corrupt behavior? And how do we shift away economies from extractive towards regenerative processes? Now, this is the part about how we can do things and harness essentially the power of peacemaking, development, security communities, even humanitarian delivery actors to contribute to climate change and reduction of conflict. But there is another slide that I'd like to focus on, which is, another map, which is on the right-hand side. This is a map which was published in 2018 by the International Institute for Sustainable Development. I remember it was actually in the first edition of the Environmental Peacebuilding Conference in California. This is a map that correlates levels of state fragility with the location of the type of materials that we need in order to transition towards a decarbonized and digital world. So far, Europe and the United States, like the rest of the world, have been very, very dependent on China for the provision of rare earths and other type of critical materials. And because of the rise of power, in power of China, Europe, the United States, other actors are looking elsewhere. And as it so happens, the critical materials that we need are located in highly fragile zones, conflict affected for the most part, but they're also located in the very same areas that we need to regenerate. So there is a very, very strong tension in the way that we envisage and go about, the climate transitions. And this concerns very strongly also, the foresight capacity of people working in conflict and fragile zones, understanding what the risks are today of not regenerating, of not working with ecosystem-based approaches, with ecological design and with water retention landscapes, but also what are the risks that are incoming very rapidly as a result of the geopolitical competition oriented towards access and processing of those raw materials that are necessary essentially to economic growth in industrialized and advanced economies. So there is a larger conversation that peacemaking, development and humanitarian actors need to be a part of, and we need to create that enabling environment where we start looking at the macro problems, what we're facing, what we're embarking upon when we talk about the transition. This is one of our blind spots, and how we can reconcile, mitigate some fundamental problems that are going to come out of this transition in a very granular way, taking into account contexts, people's cultures, and people's ways of organizing themselves around economies and natural resources. I'll stop for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Fascinating. Your discussion about moving from extractive to regenerative, I think, is brilliant. And I completely agree with you on the need to redefine security. I really do. And I say that as someone who spent my career in the defense sector. But let me just pose one question to you. And I would love to hear you and Corey talk about abundance, because I think you're talking about that in different ways, and it would be very fascinating to hear that. But let me just ask you quickly, while I agree with you, and I think everything you said was right and brilliant, NATO's poised for war, potentially, over Ukraine with a nuclear armed country right now. And so when you say we need to change our priorities, how do we do that?
So this is a really good question, because this is also something that we're struggling with at the moment. What we have to recognize is essentially that when I talk about reconceptualizing security, in the first place, I'm talking about integrating new types of data around biophysics and ecology. So as to see essentially how, in the context, for example, of this sort of red belt that you see in the left-hand map, how we have underestimated, misapprehended the role of the environment as a long-standing and unfolding driver of insecurity in some places, security in others, but where essentially we have misunderstood also the role that those ecosystems play from a global perspective, because it's not just a matter of carbon sequestration, right? If you look at the Congo Basin, for example, it hosts very large amounts of biodiversity that we need for a number of reasons. But one of the things that I'm particularly concerned about is the fact that those ecosystems actually generate and distribute water all around the globe. So the Congo Basin distributes, for example, water to the Ethiopian highlands that are responsible for the running of the Nile. They distribute water to the Sahel, to Zimbabwe, to Southern Africa. They even distribute all the way up to Europe. If we keep on cutting down essentially those ecosystems, even when we talk about offsetting strategies or whatever, we actually run the risk of creating global levels of water scarcity with associated problems around inequality, marginalization, various forms and forms of violence, between violent extremism to social protests to different things. And the cascading risks that are coming from ecological disruptions, climate disruptions, haven't yet been fully conceptualized in the way that we understand global security. Now, taking into account ecological dynamics and drivers doesn't mean that we sort of forget about overarching geopolitical tensions, right? And obviously we need to look at the way that, the current geopolitical constellation with China, the way in which, the alliance with Russia, for example, and we're seeing it yesterday at the Security Council over Ukraine, how it's creating new not waves, but rather walls of insecurity sort of threaten different parts of the world, right? And so this is something that we need to address with different tools. We can look, for example, at how I'm invited, for example, at the OSCE later in March to talk about the potential for environmental dialogue to engage with partners in Eastern Europe, in Russia, and how to create confidence building tools on the basis of collective security. But in order to have those confidence building tools, we also need the right type of data. We also need to understand why it is, obviously of everybody's interest to cooperate on collective stakes that affect different nations and different people in different ways. But it's a larger conversation, and I appreciate very much your question. It's a very real conundrum in terms of priorities.
It's great, and hopefully we'll have a little time for us all to talk about it, because again, I think there's some really productive crosstalk to be had here. We're also getting wonderful questions and comments. But with that, I want to turn to our last speaker, Tracy Hart. So Tracy holds two concurrent roles right now. She is the global lead for environmental risk management and environmental social framework, as well as the global lead for fragile and conflict states, both for the environment, natural resources, and blue economy global practice, which is all at the World Bank. And what you should know about Tracy is that she is a very important leader in World Bank and in the international community. We're lucky to have someone of her seniority and expertise to wrap up this discussion with her presentation. And Tracy, I'm delighted that you could join us and can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm just a practitioner in all of this, and I've come to the kind of analytical side of this really late in my career. So I just have a few, I took the concept of blind spots literally, as you can see with my driving perspective. I'm also teaching my teenager how to drive, which is why I also took this so literally. And my first blind spot is that really a lot of development institutions are averse to the terminology of environmental peace building. And I just wanted to mark this because, what that we think about, we don't do peace building. We don't do peace building. Peace building is a governance issue. We do, we basically help to alleviate poverty, and we help to increase shared prosperity, but we don't get into this conflict peace building nexus. And I can tell you, I've been in many meetings where people said, no, just take out the conflict, just anywhere you see it, take it out and put in resilience or something. Because resilience we can embrace, but we can't embrace or guarantee peace building or reducing conflict. That's out of our sphere. And so I just use that to challenge people to say, what is someone's mandate to do environmental peace building? So another organization may very well shrink from. And that goes for all sorts of other terminology with respect to climate security, et cetera, et cetera. The second point has been made by several speakers before me, and it's good because then I get to drive it home, which is that it is not necessarily natural resource scarcity which causes conflict, but it is both natural resource scarcity and natural resource abundance. And not only that, but it is the changes in the economic valuation of natural resource assets that most specifically cause or exacerbate conflict. And Olivia just spoke about this with regards to green minerals and moving from a fossil fuel-based international economy to one where green minerals are suddenly very high in demand. And you see when we have changes in whether it be in the country valuation or the global valuation of natural resource assets, that's where we see a rising conflict. So that's just a spot where I think we don't drive that point home enough, and therefore I think it's a blind spot. The third blind spot is that we talk about environmental peace building as an intervention that is grossly underfunded and underappreciated in our institutions. And what I would challenge people to say or to think about is that it is a sustained commitment to improve client environmental capacity that is as important or more important than what we do specific to environmental peace building. And that whether it is in countries that are perpetually fragile or which go in and out of conflict, that often the environmental institutions are extremely poorly funded, have poor capacity, and that if we don't address this root cause, then the overlay of, or the veneer of environmental peace building work, which is a very small percentage even of the overall environmental funding agenda, will not make a difference. I'm being a bit provocative in this, but I want to drive this point home. And I have a fourth new blind spot, which came up during my thoughts with the previous speakers, which is that often in situations or areas where there is fragility or conflict, there are interventions to inject money into local communities in the form of social protection or cash for work projects. And many, many times I have visited such projects and seen, again, I'm being provocative, that they are actually, if not done well, they're actually degrading the natural resource assets that are already scarce. That if you do not have strong technical advisors to work with these community-based projects, that they will essentially strip away the topsoil or degrade what type of property rights are actually embedded in the communities. And that we cannot just throw money into community-based management and say, this is going to work because we're actually planting trees, or we're actually giving, solar energy to bring up groundwater for, that again, and this point was made, I believe, by Corey, but perhaps I'm not right on that, is that we can actually, our interventions that are adjacent to our work can actually do more harm than good. And that we have to, at the very least, make sure we do no harm before we can get into the doing good side of the equation. Back to you, Sharon. Thank you.
Okay, that's a lot to think about do no harm before you can do good. And in that respect, I just wanted to ask you, when you say that lack of capacity, of environment capacity, to do meaningful work in that space is one of the big problems. How do you, and when I say you, I mean the World Bank, how do you, when you have a government that's putting its money elsewhere, how do you influence that prioritization? How are you able to? I mean, or do they have the right to put all of their money into their military or somewhere else? How do you change that dynamic?
Well, I mean, I work both on the environmental impact assessment side and I work on the fragile and conflict states side. And what I always argue is that for every dollar we're spending directly on environmental institutions or environmental capacity, there are hundreds, if not thousands of dollars spent for environmental impact assessment and environmental impact mitigation for large scale transportation projects or ports or regional electricity projects. And that often, if I can go in and capture 1 to 5% of a budget for a large scale billion-dollar energy project, that actually can swamp or double, or the money that's going directly into investment in environmental institutions. And so I really try to wage and influence that side of the equation to say, okay, when we are doing building, let's make sure that the building is environmentally sustainable, and the leakage of that back into strengthening environmental institutions hopefully will work as well. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that that's been, even though everyone's used different words, it seems like it's been a thread throughout that rather than have this be a separate thing that we have to address separately, the question is, how do we integrate the kinds of considerations you're talking about, Tracy, into all investments and all governance and all management, so that it's part of it, not just something separate. Hopefully that's a fair interpretation. Would you agree with that? I think
absolutely.
Yeah, Catherine said mainstreaming into climate finance. We're actually, it's amazing how fast an hour can pass. So we're in the final third of our time here. And I'm going to ask Daniel and Allison to help pull out some of the questions, but also invite anybody who would like to ask questions to raise your hands or add into the chat at this point. I do want to call out one comment that I really liked from David Tsai, who said, this has been an excellent session that calls to examine the macro, what's behind the geopolitical curtain, while also accounting for the micro at the community level, as Jerome articulated so well. Great presentations, everyone, because I agree with that completely. It's been fascinating to hear all of you put together the pieces of a mosaic that's creating a very rich picture. And we will have time at the end here to hear from Allison Brown from AID. But before that, Daniel, were there particular questions you want to throw? I see someone has said we wanted to hear the responses to Enrique's question, but I would have a hard time finding where Enrique's question is. Enrique, do you want to ask it? Or I see you asked something at noon, so if you're not unmuting, I'm going to just read it. The first part of the presentation was very much on the changes developing countries have to do, the transition of extractive to regenerative economies of developing countries, et cetera. But what is the role of industrialized countries in that approach? Extractive economies are promoted by industrialized economies, many times making use of corruption gaps and weak political governance in the global South. I think there are a lot of actions, political and economic, to take in the global North to really foster the change that you describe. That would turn the scope to the global South and less top-down sustainable developing approach. Okay, that is a fair question for everyone who spoke. I think he was directing it specifically at Olivia. So Olivia, do you want to respond first?
Yes, and I think it's a really great question. Thank you, Enrique. This is one of the key questions that drove the publication that we wrote at Carnegie. So the first thing that I'm going to say is you sort of said, you know, that I point towards what conflict affected and fragile zones have to do. I'm going to try to flip that around. Industrialized economies tend to outsource their greenhouse gas emissions and environmental destruction outside of their borders. I'll give the example of the European Union. One of the reasons where we can say we're only responsible for 7% currently of global greenhouse gas emissions is because a lot of them are actually dispersed and fragmented throughout the supply chains upon which we rely, which connect us to Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So the very first thing that we need to do is really sort of, you know, be very transparent and very accurate in how we do supply chain analysis and how we outsource and export essentially the risks associated to ecological disruptions and environmental plundering. That obviously means that we need to re-examine the way in which we do economic modeling in advanced societies, but also at a global level. And I think that this is an underlying question which is being asked in many different arenas at the moment, at the WTO, at the IMF, at a number of different bilateral conversations. But it's a really, really complex question, because at the end of the day, and this is, I'll be very frank about the questions that, you know, I have in my mind at the moment. You know, since the Second World War, we have built a globally and economically integrated system for the pursuit of stability, equilibriums, and peace to a certain extent. Some regions were better served in terms of peace than others. And this is something that we're reckoning with today. But if we start changing economic interdependencies, and if we start looking at how to rebalance, I'll say, the economic metabolism of the world, then we have to understand exactly what kind of risks we run into regarding global stability, global peacekeeping, global peacemaking, et cetera, et cetera. The reason why I'm taking this 10,000 feet high level conversation is because at the end of the day, what we have to do is indeed sort of look at what are extractive industries used for in terms of economic growth? Where are the benefits going? And the economic dividends going? How are they redistributed at local level, or at local level where stuff are extracted or where they're processed? And how do we reorganize for collective resilience, at an international level? So there is a lot of things, a lot of responsibility that befalls on industrialized nations, and on how do we do economic sort of remodeling internationally, which obviously means different types of processes, different types of consultations, and taking into account all of the things also that were mentioned before, including what Jerome, you were saying in terms of how we value nature in very different ways. And this is a key part of the conversation as well between
Thank
cultures.
you, Olivia. That's great. And we're almost out of time. I want to make sure we have time to hear from Allison as one of our sponsors. But there's been a very rich conversation in the chat, including Allison pointed out, starting at about 11:29, many of the participants flagged other gaps. So I just want to throw that out there. Do any of our panelists have a comment they want to make on any of the questions or on each other? You know, certainly Corey, Catherine, Joram, we haven't heard from you in a while. So, I mean, do you want to make any comments on each other's comments? That would be, we have time for like one observation if someone wants to jump in on that from our panel. Okay, even though I'm calling you out by name, I won't make you comment, but go ahead, Corey.
I'm happy to mention something. I mean, I think just to say they were all fantastic. As you pointed out, I think there's a really rich conversation that we won't have time for about sort of the way that in abundance, I think that abundance thread between Tracy, Olivia, and myself, I'd love to keep talking about that. I think one of the gaps that we didn't really get into, but I mean, Catherine talked about climate finance, and I also want to echo all of the points she made. I think one of the things that concerns me, maybe I'll just take this, is that not about her presentation at all, but just the sheer volume of adaptation financing that is going to come, right? It won't probably be enough, and it may not be what has been promised, but the sheer scale up of that. I think, especially if it follows the trajectory that it's been today, which is almost 90% at the national level, is going to present real risks. I think for a lot of the things we've been discussing, and I think trying to wrap our heads around that, I think it's also an answer to Enrique's question, right? I mean, well, one thing that industrialized countries can do is live up to those commitments on climate adaptation financing, of course. But then when that money comes, I mean, all the things that Tracy was discussing about the capacity, in particular the technical capacity at local levels, I think even though those are known factors, right? Those are known to everybody on the panel and probably most of the participants, just the sheer scale of that, I think, is something that's going to be unprecedented and something that, given trajectories on fragility and conflict that we've been seeing, it's not shaping up well, right? I think it's something we all need to be thinking about a lot. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Corey. And I do want to direct people to the chat to see Tracy Hart's response to Enrique also, because very interesting. And Catherine, you got your hand up. Last word from you before we go to Allison.
No problem. Thanks so much, Sharon. And just thanks to all as well. Really, really interesting discussion. And I got so much as well from chat. And to Tracy's points as well, I think, as you said, it's about doing what we do better. Technical solutions to adaptation, to mitigation, are also opportunities to build peace. I think on the finance side of things as well, we're still talking about the $100 billion mark 11 years later after Copenhagen. We haven't got there. And African climate change negotiators are saying, the order of magnitude is actually $1.2 trillion. But if we're not changing access to finance, if we're not making sure that conflict-affected and fragile contexts have access to finance, then their vulnerability will continue to increase over time vis-a-vis other countries. And if you look at the top 20 fragile state recipients of climate finance, only 2 of them are extremely fragile. And I think finance provides a really important metric here. Last year, according to the Swedish think tank SIPRI, their study of military spending, it peaked at almost $2 trillion last year. And we can't find 100 billion for climate finance. And again, 100 billion alone isn't going to fix things unless we kind of strengthen the access and address the specific issues that fragile and conflict contexts face in terms of the access to climate finance.
Thank you, Jerome. You can sneak in a last comment here before we turn things over to Allison, please.
Yeah, indeed, and I'll be very brief. I just wanted to also speak to what Tracy mentioned in terms of changes in economic evaluation of natural resource assets, and I think this helps us to understand that when these conflicts take place, as I said earlier, they are not taking place within a vacuum. Neither are the technical solutions that we would like to also sort of implement. They don't take place also within a vacuum. They occur in a context where people have particular ways of life, ways of being, and ways of interpreting what they encounter. And I think if we don't factor that into consideration, our approaches will never be, sustainable. We can have as much technology as we want, as much money as we want, but it will not be sustainable unless we really build on where people are. And so it's also important to sort of shift, we often hear bottom-up approach or start from where people are, but I think often it's easy to say that than to actually do it meaningfully. And I think it's important to remind ourselves of that. Thanks.
Thank you, Jerome. I think that's an excellent last word before we have Allison bring us home. For those of you who don't know her, Allison Brown is an official at the U.S. Agency for International Development. She first came there as a AAAS fellow, which is a very important fellowship in the United States that brings technical and scientific talent into government. Her time at USAID has included climate environment positions in the Bureau for Democracy, Conflict and Humanitarian Assistance, the Bureau for Africa, and now in the Bureau for Conflict Prevention and Stabilization. I know her as a cogent, passionate, and important voice within my government on how we can do climate security right. So I'm really delighted to turn it over to her for some closing thoughts.
Sharon, you embarrassed me. Thank you for that introduction. But thank you, Maureen. I know you wanted to get to my remarks, but I would have been thrilled to listen to the panelists talk and exchange for much longer. This has been such an amazing conversation. And when we first got together to just understand what everyone was kind of come through, we knew that it was going to be a really interesting interaction, and it has not disappointed. So thank you. I just wanted to really briefly touch upon, we started this conversation, Sharon talked about how a lot of times we are stymied by sectoral and silos, and by saying, well, this is a military issue rather than a development issue. I think that we have all heard that this is absolutely climate and environmental peace building, climate security, however we want to frame it. And to Tracy's point, we have to frame it right. We have to get it so that the communication of the issue that we're talking about is relevant and accessible to our policymakers, to our leadership, to those who have the purse strings, and we need to be able to then translate it down to the ground. As Sharon said, I am also I'm an environmental officer. I'm the Bureau Environmental Officer. I'm in charge of environmental compliance. Tracy, to your point on the environmental and social impact approach and the benefits and downfalls of that part, from the access it gives us to the box checking exercises. We need to make sure that we are not continuing that as we bring conflict into the conversation, but using it as a way to get into these places that don't have access to the finance because they're too fragile. We don't have that. The role that I play, I see all types of programming because it is a requirement. And at that same time, because it's a requirement, people want to just throw it out the door and leave it to last. And we need to find good ways to embed these conversations, getting the concept that abundance as well as scarcity is promoting these conflicts. That can help us, if we understand the environmental situation, it can help us understand where to predict or where to kind of lean into the conflict situation. If we take into consideration the relationship of people and their culture to the environment, and how passionately they're going to support, defend, and fight for that, the access to those resources, then we're going to be in a better space. To Elliot's point, we do have a really narrow well of programming because there's been this lack of intersecting priorities and intersecting understanding of how to embed conflict and or peace building with environment. That is such a small section. And as I talk to one of the other roles I play is as one of the lead drafters of our USAID climate strategy. And as we are talking with our climate colleagues, it is, we want to do a ton of mitigation. We want to do a lot of adaptation, a lot of finance, but we're not talking about, and the corruption aspect, the access aspect is coming in, but it's not forefront on people's minds. And I think that we need to help make a much stronger connection between what are we capable of doing versus where is the access being limited and how can we improve that. I also really appreciated Corey bringing up this concept of injustice and inequality being, having a huge impact on conflict, on the perceived or experience and or experienced realities of what is our rights, what is our access to the things that we need to live and the things that we care about. So I just really appreciate it. And specifically, I think that it was Olivia who talked about these conflict actors being on the front lines of climate change. And that is a huge message that I specifically am going to take away. These panelists brought up blind spots and gaps in our knowledge and our understanding from their perspectives. this is not supposed to be comprehensive. This is supposed to be the start of a conversation rather than a comprehensive analysis of the conversation. And so I do want to thank all of you for participating. Thank you, Sharon, for doing such an amazing job at moderating. And I do hope that this really is the start of a conversation instead of the summary of one.
I wish we could all go somewhere around a table and continue the conversation and also figure out, since we have such an interesting mix of funders and doers here, in addition to deep thinkers, to have that conversation together about not just what we need to do, but how we do it is a real privilege. So I thank you all for joining. We were better at ending on time than I thought, especially because we covered such a wide range of topics and ideas. And as Allison said, I hope it's the beginning of a conversation and a set of solutions that we can work on together. Daniel, did you want to say anything in closing, since we have a couple minutes left?
Yeah, just to redouble what Allison said, that the intentions of this panel was quite purposefully not geographically or sectorally focused to identify first, what are we missing? What are the gaps, obviously? And also, where are these different themes converging? And I think that there's a number of examples from this discussion that point to that, which for me is a huge win and highlights why we need to be quite purposeful about speaking across sector and across discipline. And I can't agree more. This was supposed to be the start of the conversation, because the severity and the breadth of the issues that we're going to deal with are, unfortunately, by every indication, going to get bigger and more diverse geographically. So ensuring that we continue this conversation, and that includes to the panelists, and I'm really also impressed with the chat, is really important to me, and I think to aid as well. So would love to continue to communicate, and thanks so much to the panelists for bringing wonderful presentations, and Sharon, as always, for doing a wonderful job of making a really complicated conversation streamlined and clearly communicated.
I'm just excited to see so many people who are trying to get this right, because it's not easy, and it's also easy to get negative and depressed about how hard this is. And I didn't hear that from anybody. Everybody here is trying to figure out how to get it right, and some people are actually putting it into practice in real time. So my appreciation for all of you for the discussion and for the work you're doing all the time, and for the wonderful conversation in the chat. So take care, everybody, and enjoy the rest of NPACS. It's been fantastic so far, and someday we will all be able to see each other in person around a table. I'm sure of that. So take care in the meantime.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks a lot, everyone.